After I read the booklet, I realized that I should have covered adenocarcinomas and chordomas and all. I didn't know that, so I've not included much of that. And towards the end of the admin, I've kept a couple of, I would say, exotic cases which may interest a senior audience like this. Okay, so giant cell-rich tumors essentially have multinuclear giant cells, and every lesion has giant cells to some extent, but there are some lesions which have a lot of giant cells, and I think some of these have been, many of these have been covered yesterday, so I'm really going to be very fast. Chondroblastomas, chondromyxoid fibromas, osteoblastomas, telangiectatic osteosarcomas, or the giant cell-rich osteosarcomas. Amongst tumor-like lesions, we have aneurysmal bone cysts, giant cell reparative granulomas, which usually occur in the small bones of the hands and feet, non-ossifying fibromas. Langerhans cell histiocytosis can have a lot of giant cells. Amongst metabolic lesions, brown tumor is the most common one, and we do see a lot of infective, especially tuberculosis. And once in a while, we have also seen more exotic lesions like rhinosporidiosis in the bone and some other fungal infections. Okay, true giant cell tumor extends, radiologically it extends to the end of the bone, and that's a feature which I use to say that, well, this is likely to be a giant cell tumor. We often see large lesions which have gone into the soft tissue. And another example to show a giant cell tumor extending to the end of the bone. And a true giant cell tumor has this multinucleate giant cells which in the garden variety are supposed to be uniformly, diffusely distributed, and the accompanying spindly cells are not fibrous looking, they are short, ovoid, and they seem to be intricately blended with the edges of the giant cells. So there's a morphologic kind of continuum, a cytologic continuum between the spindle cells and the giant cells. But all giant cells don't look like each other. The reason is giant cells have a life, that's what I feel. In their active growth phase, they are much more cellular, but over a period of time, they can undergo various changes. They can undergo cystic change, hemorrhage, necrosis. Then they can become, the necrotic areas are filled up with fatty cells, histiocytes, and it leads to difficulty in diagnosis for a pathologist. And here you see that there are some giant cells here, but here they're almost nil and it's fibrous. And in these different pictures, you see the different appearances of a giant cell tumor. And one of the appearances which worries us surgical pathologists a lot is the presence of osteoid. Because the presence of osteoid, the osteoid is reactive, but when there's osteoid, we start wondering, could it be a giant cell-rich osteosarcoma? And occasionally we have got into trouble. And they can have aneurysmal bone cyst-like areas or what look like true aneurysmal bone cyst foci. Mitosis are not at all uncommon, and the maximum mitosis which are, so to say, acceptable is about 15 or even 20 per 10 HiPA field. But the presence of mitosis does worry a pathologist, and sometimes the cells don't look all that spindly, and they look little rounded. And since we see giant cell tumor, for some reason they say is more common in Asian countries, and I don't know what the reasons are, and this has been well documented in even the older literature. So here, when you have this kind of an appearance with hardly any giant cells, and the cells look rather ovoid rather than spindly, and there is some amount of matrix, then in a core nadal biopsy, I do have a level of difficulty in distinguishing a giant cell-rich osteosarcoma or an osteosarcoma from a giant cell tumor. So if the X-ray is typical, it bails me out. And I said the presence of osteoid, and although we do say that this osteoid is reparative and reactive, But I do have a level of difficulty, and I would like to ask Dr. Rosenberg to give some comments as to how he sorts out this kind of a problem. And for some reason, a lot of our giant cell tumors seem to have a lot of osteoid. And in fact, Franco once said that I should review all this and find out, because I think he and Carrie Inwards looked at this and they have published about presence of osteoid in giant cell tumors. But because some of my cases I have referred to him for consultation, and he says that he too finds them very tough, and why is it that they seem to have so much of osteoid? Now, I have no explanation for that. Okay. Now, this is a chondroblastoma. It is an epiphyseal lesion. The original name, or the old name of chondroblastoma, was giant cell tumor of cartilage, because just like the giant cell tumor, the chondroblastomas also show a lot of giant cells, and usually they are small, and I think we have seen a lot of this. Talus and small bones of the foot are not uncommon sites for a chondroblastoma. And in addition to giant cell, this tumor has these cells which are pink, have a histiocytic look, they have an eosinophilic cytoplasm, the nuclei look folded, and many nuclei show grooves. And in addition, these tumors show calcification, and in a small biopsy, there can be a level of difficulty in distinguishing a true giant cell tumor from a chondroblastoma. And we have seen huge chondroblastomas, and it does cause a problem sometimes, especially when you don't see the grooves well, and there is no calcification. Several of these tumors can be associated with an ABC component, and chondroblastoma is one of them. And you can see how it is, the ABC component is highlighted over here. And in addition to the chondroblastoma, we have this on histology as well. The message for the junior members of the audience is, if you see an ABC-like tumor, one should always try and see the big picture, just to make sure that there isn't another pre-existing primary lesion. The next is chondromyxoid fibromas, and we saw a lot of these yesterday. These tumors are often on the cortex, have a little bubbly appearance. They are in the metaphysis, and this is one such tumor in a 10-year-old girl. We have seen huge chondromyxoid fibromas and all the varieties. This is one which was restricted to the cortex. They often show a sclerotic medullary border, and histologically chondromyxoid fibromas can have giant cells. Although it's not very rich in giant cells, but in a biopsy it's quite possible that I may get an area which is not so chondromyxoid and which is more giant cell rich, and hence I thought that I should include this too in my discussion on giant cell tumors. Now, coming to the bone forming tumors, which again we have seen yesterday. These are two examples of osteoblastoma, one in the vertebra, and this is a resected specimen of a osteoblastoma. And we can see that in addition to the cellular tumor, there are a lot of these cavernous spaces, and osteoblastoma also is another lesion which can be associated with an ABC-like component. And this is the histology, and there is this large thin septae and cavernous spaces. But if we look at the walls of this, then one can identify the true osteoblastoma. And I think we saw examples of that yesterday. Telangiectatic osteosarcoma is another lesion which can have a lot of giant cells, and here this is a telangiectatic osteosarcoma which has this huge blown out appearance, and histologically these tumors are very, very hemorrhagic, and the cells are rather few, but fortunately for the pathologist, the cells are very anaplastic, so making a cytological diagnosis of sarcoma is not very difficult. Well, we have seen several giant cell rich osteosarcomas which are not really telangiectatic, and as I mentioned, we do have a problem distinguishing them from giant cell tumors of bone. Now, osteoblastomas can mimic or rather giant cell tumors, osteoblastomas can mimic telangiectatic osteosarcomas. The reason is osteoblastomas also have this, it's a very vascular tumor and has this vascular spaces, and it does have all these giant cells. And these are examples of telangiectatic osteosarcomas, and the original description was such that when a surgeon went in, he almost fell in a pit of blood because the whole thing was nothing but a huge blood clot, and the lesional cells were very few and far apart. Okay, now coming to tumor-like lesions, aneurysmal bone cyst is a very well-known common lesion, particularly seen in younger patients. It can be primary or metastatic, and primary or secondary, and the secondary aneurysmal bone cyst has another specific component like a chondroblastoma, osteoblastoma, chondromyxoid fibroma, true giant cell tumor, etc. Now in recent years it has been shown that the primary variety of aneurysmal bone cyst has a typical genetic signature, and so these are likely to be the true neoplasms. And this is an example of an aneurysmal bone cyst, and one does see a Codman's triangle. Do you agree that it's a Codman's triangle? Yeah, in a primary aneurysmal bone cyst. And this is to show the fluid levels. This is the resected specimen, and it has this fibrous septae compartmentalizing these spaces, and this is the histology, and we did see examples of that. And aneurysmal bone cyst is rich in giant cells, so it does come in the differential diagnosis. And this is one feature highlighted by Dr. Darlin, and he says that this bone which is there at the periphery of these aneurysmal spaces has a chondroid aura. And I find that very useful to make a diagnosis, especially in situations where the aneurysmal bone cyst is not so cystic and it is rather solid. So this blue colored chondroid-like tissue or bone with chondroid aura helps me to make a more confident diagnosis. We did discuss Langerhans cell histiocytosis yesterday in great detail, and as Dr. Rosenberg mentioned, the Langerhans cell histiocytosis can appear like a granuloma because the histiocytes gather together in a granuloma-like formation. And the true proliferating cells are these dendritic Langerhans cells, which have this folded nuclei, abundant cytoplasm, and they too show grooves. And the eosinophils, which are in variable proportion, are actually the reactive population. Coming to non-ossifying fibroma, because this is another lesion which can have a lot of giant cells, and non-ossifying fibromas are usually eccentric lytic lesions with a lobulated medullary end, not at all an uncommon lesion in general practice. And histologically, the giant cells are not ubiquitous but often clustered, and between the giant cells one sees fibrous tissue which is unlike the ovoid and blue looking cells, spindly cells which one sees in a true giant cell tumor. In addition, there can be other inflammatory cells like a few lymphocytes and histiocytes, and foamy, especially foamy histiocytes. Okay, now coming to the brown tumor. Brown tumor essentially is due to a metabolic condition. It can be due to parathyroid hyperplasia or parathyroid adenoma, and it presents as a lytic lesion, and there are a whole lot of radiological appearances on the basis of which one can suspect that this is not a true giant cell tumor, but it is a brown tumor of hyperparathyroidism, and I won't go into the details of that. And small pockets of a brown tumor of hyperparathyroidism can be almost indistinguishable from a true giant cell tumor. But again, to stress the fact that the spindly cells in a brown tumor of hyperparathyroidism are more fibrous looking. They are elongated, they have more collagen, unlike the spindly cells of a true giant cell tumor. And in addition, since this is basically a reparative process due to the underlying metabolic disease. It does have a lot of these loose myofibroblastic proliferation, and one does see a lot of bone in a brown tumor of hyperparathyroidism. Okay. Now coming to infective thing, this is a 40-year-old female who had a pain in the shoulder, and we see this large lytic lesion which on this image has got highlighted. And histologically we saw a lot of giant cells. Now these giant cells have the typical horseshoe or Langhans giant cell appearance. In addition to the giant cells, there are a lot of inflammatory cells, lymphocytes, etc. And there are, of course, granulomas. And sorry, I think I deleted that picture with granulomas. It does have a lot of epithelioid histiocytes, and this is tuberculosis of the bone. And we do see tuberculosis affecting every organ and any bone in the body and at any age. And the fact that 25% of non-tumorous lesions of bone, particularly infections, mimic bone tumors, is something which we need to keep in mind all the time. Now, in the bone, my personal experience is difficulty arises because the granulomas very often are not very characteristic and they are very subtle. And well, we do have the garden variety where we have the caseous necrosis, the granulomas and the Langhans giant cell, but very often we only get a handful of epithelioid histiocytes which are not forming true granulomas. And especially in the spine it can be very frustrating because we get a very small amount of material and we don't see the true granulomas. And we have done a study wherein we have done PCR on formalin fixed paraffin embedded tissue. It's published in Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery, and we found that the correlation was very good in cases where as pathologists we had only a suspicion, but we could prove that convincingly with the help of PCR studies for mycobacteria. Okay, now just a few exotic cases. We do see hydatid disease of the bone. So this was a lesion which was radiologically, Manish, you may perhaps remember, the diagnosis was whether it could be a chondroma, enchondroma or a chondrosarcoma, and you see a large segment of the bone which is involved by this lytic lesions, and there is some amount of endosteal erosion. I have not gotten into the detail, but I just kept the gross picture to show, and we were very fortunate because they did suspect that, before surgery, and we took out the aspirate and we could see the live scoliosis. So it was fun to show all the residents, everybody came down and saw the scoliosis, which are the suckers or the mouthpieces. Okay, Nora's lesion, Dr. Shah Alam is not there, but he was wanting to know about Nora's lesion, also known as BPOP, initially described in hands and feet. It has a stuck-on appearance and a cartilage cap. And Manish, you may recollect this patient again, it's your patient, and he had this single lesion and subsequently he developed another lesion. And as you see in this clinical photograph, it is seen as a swelling on the lateral side, and these are the surgical pictures, and this is how the gross of Nora's lesion looked like. Okay, long bone involvement is known, and 17 of 65 cases published by Dr. Uni occurred in the long bones. And this is the histology of BPOP. It has this osteochondroid-like stuff scattered in this loose spindly proliferation, and this blue-colored chondroid tissue is what gives it its very characteristic appearance. Now, vascular lesions have not really included in great detail, but we have seen a fair numbers of hemangiomas, epithelioid hemangioendotheliomas, and angiosarcomas, and very often they affect multiple bones. As you see, several bones in the hand have been involved by this, and here you can see that the tuft has almost disappeared due to the presence of this hemangioma. Here again another case showing multiple lesions involving several bones, and very often they are associated with the peripheral area of sclerosis. Now my take on this as a pathologist is, when these are biopsied, the pathologist often feels that what he's seeing is insignificant, because he just sees a blood vessel and he just sees some fibrin, and the report often goes out as not representative. And I have seen hemangiomas being biopsied 2 and 3 times and 4 times, because nobody has, they have not sat together and say, well, this can be a hemangioma. Okay, now this is an interesting case. This lady who was 26-year-old when I saw her had history of surgery 12 years ago, and then she had this recurrent lesion. She came from another city, and you can see this huge lesion, and you could see this cement which was put during her first surgery. And here you see this net-like appearance, and there's a lot of opacification. And well, Manish is not here, but the radiological appearance, my radiologist and Manish, and they said probably this looks like an osteosarcoma. I don't know what your take on this would be, Dr. Letson.
Well, I think if it was an osteosarcoma, it would have to be a low-grade osteosarcoma.
Okay.
Because there's complete mineralization and the periostome completely surrounding itself.
Yeah.
If you put in a low-grade osteosarcoma, but I just don't think that looks like true bone formation.
Yeah.
In the synovium.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm looking at something unusual and not a low-grade osteosarcoma.
Yeah. So, well, they did a biopsy, and I said that this is a hemangioma, and the fact that she's had it excised once and it has grown again slowly in that same area. But Manish did send the x-rays to Murli, and Murli said, yes, this is a osteosarcoma, but when they excised the specimen, this is how it looked, and it was actually a hemangioma, and in the interstices we just saw a lot of bone, and we do know that blood vessels and endothelial cells can stimulate osteogenesis. And well, this was a hemangioma, and the patient is doing fine. This again was another example of a hemangioma, but I want to show you this picture, and this is a hemangioendothelioma. It could also very well be an angiosarcoma, because they don't have a very specific radiological appearance. I don't think I have kept histology pictures of the same. Now I'm going to show you we have several unusual lesions, and I thought that I could show you several of them, but I chose 3. I'm going to show you a melanotic neuroectodermal tumor of infancy, a phosphaturic mesenchymal tumor, and a rhinosporidiosis of the clavicle. All these cases are published, so I'll just go over there very briefly. This was a 12-month-old infant who was referred with a swelling in the right thigh, and physical examination revealed a diffuse swelling. He underwent an FNAC, and this is how the radiograph looked like. The bone was distorted, and there was some sclerosis and lytic areas. And this is how the histology looked like. We had this very obviously malignant round cells, but in addition we could see this pigment in the FNAC itself. And we did suspect that this was a melanotic neuroectodermal tumor of infancy, but almost all of these lesions occur in the gnathic bones and in the maxilla. So this was indeed a very unusual site, and this was how the excised specimen looked like. It had these malignant round cells, and it had also a lot of pigment. And what our surgeons did in this case was a very unusual kind of surgery. They removed the bone, they scraped off all the melanotic tumor, which was in the soft tissue, and then they subjected the bone to extracorporeal irradiation and reimplanted the bone in the patient's thigh. And this is how the post-operative specimen looked like. Okay, now he did well at least for a year. Ashish has not come, and I think we can get the follow-up from him. Well, melanotic neuroectodermal tumors have been reported. When I looked up the literature for this case, they have been reported in various odd sites like the testes and, in the common sites. Yeah. So this is a 39-year-old patient with a chronic pain in the foot for the past 2 years. She later, which was attributed to stress fractures. She later developed pain in both thighs and she was referred to an endocrinology unit of one of the major medical colleges. And after all laboratory investigations, they thought that this was a case of oncogenic osteomalacia. However, clinical examination did not reveal any tumor. So then the patient had this was a biochemical profile, the serum calcium levels were normal. Everything supported a diagnosis of oncogenic osteomalacia, and these were the stress fractures which are seen in the femoral bones. And an MRI revealed a heterogeneous mass breaking through the capsule anteriorly and abutting the meniscus. So this is what they found on the MRI. And a FDG PET scan revealed increased uptake in the foot due to the stress fracture, but it also revealed increased uptake in the popliteal fossa. And this is a MRI angiogram, and we can see the tumor in the popliteal fossa. And the tumor was excised. Manish, again your case, you'll remember this. It had a very myxoid and glistening and gelatinous appearance. And histologically, it had a very variegated appearance, but the dominant appearance was almost like that of a chondromyxoid fibroma. So it had this very myxoid areas, It had this very myxoid kind of component. It had fibrous tissue. It also had giant cells, but it also had this hemangiopericytomatous-like vascularity. And there was this grungy calcification in some of the foci. So I looked up the literature whether one does get a CMF-like appearance in a phosphatoric mesenchymal tumor, and I think I could find 1 or 2 articles, and this also we published it in view of the very unusual appearance. Now the last case, a 32-year-old farmer had noticed a swelling associated with pain in the right shoulder for the past 2 years, and the lesion had grown in the previous 6 months. And this is how it looked like, a large lesion involving the clavicle with a prominent soft tissue component. The lateral and AP images reveal this large expansilytic destructive lesion involving the lateral end of the clavicle with soft tissue extension. There was no periosteal reaction. And the lesion per se, the proximal part had a very soap bubble-like appearance. And the mass was excised. It had this very yellow kind of appearance. It was solid, cystic. It did have foci of necrosis. And it was located within the bone, destroying it, but also extending into the adjacent skeletal muscle. And histologically, we had no problem in making a diagnosis. It showed extensive permeation and destruction of the bone by these sporangia of rhinosporidiosis, which were in various stages of maturation. So bone involvement in rhinosporidiosis can occur in the following clinical settings: if there is hematogenous spread to the bones and visceral organs, but also due to local invasion of the skull bone if the lesion is involving the nasal, the nose and the paranasal sinuses. So I think that's all my presentation for today. Thank you.
So I was interested in the giant cell tumor and talking to Manish.
What is their epidemiology? But it happens in pregnancy, it happens in women more commonly, it happens at an age where vitamin D is deficient because your requirement of it is more. So that's all that is circumstantial evidence that it could be one of the factors. And we now correct the vitamin D deficiency for all these GCT patients. So we give them the vitamin D. And I found that our rate of local recurrence seems to have reduced. Although I don't have data for it, but it looks like it has gone down because the rate of local recurrence is well below 10%. So we do so many giant cell tumors, but they don't now seem to be a problem because there could be a metabolic component to what causes the giant cell tumor.
Andrew, you're a metabolic expert. What do you think? I would be very skeptical.
Yes. Nuclear stromal cells, which are felt to be the neoplastic cells, may be a precursor, an osteoblastic precursor cell, and that's why you can see varying amounts of bone within a giant cell tumor, with some giant cell tumors having a lot of bone, and so I have the same experience as you do. That's why those mononuclear cells have been shown to express rank ligand, which is the molecule that osteoblasts express to generate the osteoclasts, and that's why it's felt there's so many osteoclast-type giant cells present in giant cell tumor. And again, that's why denosumab, that monoclonal antibody, works against it. So that's the current line of thought, that it could be an osteoblast precursor cell with regards to the line of differentiation of the mononuclear stromal cell.
Well, that's
vitamin D generates a lot of interest. So, but of course there are so many of so much confounding. It's not going to come as a randomized.
you don't know unless you have
Exactly.
a very clear difference.
Exactly.
You won't be able to incriminate it.
Related to many, and I mean, people have also said is pharma, pushed by the pharma companies, and the level of vitamin D, the cutoff level to say who is deficient, has been steadily lowered. I don't know, Dr. Krishna, you may have something to add on this.
Anytime for sun in London. So the BMJ has published an interesting data, only that community living, how high is the incidence of vitamin D.
No, but then,
Farmers who are all the time in the sun, and their vitamin D levels are also low, and we can't explain that. And what we've been told by our endocrinologists is that they are not getting the right wavelength
Correct.
of UV light.
11 to 1.
Yes,
Is the
it
time
is that
period.
time. And again, they say that probably the dark skin interferes with the exposure.
and pollution.
Yeah.
No, but we
So
have
that's probably the
we had
reason.
dark skin for years and years.
Yeah.
So that I don't think is the cause.
So these are all theories, but we don't really know what is the role of vitamin D in any of these tumors. There are a lot of people who feel vitamin D is responsible for many neoplastic conditions.
Thought process, it is now very well established that vitamin D and immunity have a phenomenal direct relationship.
Absolutely.
And that in fact is one of the incriminating factors in many of the diseases.
Those resulting in osteoclastic activity and resorption of the bone. That's the current line of thought.
No, would you use denosumab?
Activity, I'm just not aware of anybody trying it on those patients.
You feel like it would make sense, but I'm not aware of anybody who's done that.
Yeah,
Just aware
I
of
think,
the
I
disease.
think there are people who are doing these trials on some of the patients, and the early results that I read have been promising. I mean, the question is that
Would
they
make
end up
sense, yeah.
otherwise with an amputation.
Yeah.
So maybe denosumab can slow down the process and then allow you to resect and reconstruct like you do in
Certainly would make
tumors.
sense, yeah.
At the MSTS this year, they're planning to kind of rename so your thoughts on that?
Well, they're surgeons, not pathologists. Aside from malignant cells, but producing what I feel is neoplastic matrix. I don't use the term malignant giant cell tumor. I feel that I end up classifying them as some other variant of sarcoma, either giant cell rich osteosarcoma or a fibroblastic sarcoma with giant cells. But I can understand why it's maybe a contentious
And
issue.
prognostically, they should do better because they have giant cells, which means their immunities are good, isn't it?
I would not necessarily agree with that. I feel that they're high-grade tumors, and I've seen some behave, very aggressively. Just because there may be local immunity or an immune reaction to the tumor doesn't always pan out to having a good prognosis. I don't know what other people feel.
Live for 3 or 4 years, but she just continues to progress and just doesn't respond. But I think there's another entity where you have giant cell tumor benign metastasis, because I've got patients with pulmonary metastasis that just take them out and they do fine. So it's a complex disease. And I think so, I think truly there is an entity of benign metastasis in giant cell tumor. And then there was the other form, which I think is giant cell rich osteosarcoma. So, I don't know. I'll leave it to pathologists as whether they call it a malignant giant cell tumor, but to me, if there's bone formation, it's going to have to be an osteosarcoma.
Yeah, but
I am the only medical oncologist in this whole group. Anyhow, I have prepared the lecture more from the point of view of non-medical oncologists, and I'll touch on some of the key facts and hope it is of interest to all of you. I come from this institute, which is situated in Delhi. It's one of the largest hospitals of India. 1,000 of those are pediatric, and we see around 250 to 300 sarcomas every year. So the first thing, tumors which require chemotherapy, it is important to know. Osteo, MFH, and Ewing's. Equally important to know which do not require chemotherapy. Chondro, giant cell tumor, and other benign tumors. I'm specifically mentioning this because many a times I get consults for chondrosarcoma inoperable from an outside hospital to refer to medical oncology for chemotherapy. Well, there is nothing that we as medical oncologists can offer a chondrosarcoma. Settings, adjuvant, neoadjuvant, and palliative. Now, 40 years ago, we all know, 50 years ago, that osteosarcoma was amputated very often. And what happened was the patients came back with metastatic disease to the lungs. This obviously implied that there was micrometastatic disease. In fact, adjuvant chemotherapy in osteosarcoma is an odyssey of rejection and vindication. And why do I say so? In 1970s, effective drugs were available, it was used, and it was shown by one group that the metastatic rate is being reduced by adjuvant chemotherapy in osteosarcoma. Then there was a publication, I believe, from Mayo Clinic, and it reported that it is not the chemotherapy, it is rather the natural history of the disease that has changed, and that even otherwise the metastatic evolution has gone down. As late as 1991, 20 years after the availability of drugs, there was still a publication that does adjuvant chemotherapy improve survival in osteosarcoma or not. And it clearly showed that adjuvant therapy reduces pulmonary metastasis, reduces the number of nodules, and improves the survival, both relapse-free and overall survival. Now the question, why neoadjuvant chemotherapy in bone tumors? One reason is that it is a micrometastatic disease, and by early institution of chemotherapy, we are killing the microfoci of the cancer cells, which eventually are the ones which kill the patient. With chemotherapy, we shrink the tumor, so easier for surgeons to operate. It gives time to make the prosthesis. And then there is not so much of urgency in the post-op period to restart chemotherapy. And we get pathological identification of the risk groups. What is the disadvantage of neoadjuvant chemotherapy in bone tumors? In osteosarcoma, you can say that it is not as chemosensitive as something like Ewing's or leukemia or lymphomas. So potentially, we are exposing a large tumor to a relatively insensitive chemotherapy. That is one potential disadvantage. So the classification of necrosis is well known because we have a lot of pathologists here, and more than 90% necrosis is considered good. I would like to share here that our own experience is that more than 90% necrosis in osteosarcoma is observed in our cohort in only 1/3 of the patients, unlike 2/3 in the West. I would also like to add here that malignant fibrous histiocytoma, which is treated like osteosarcoma, has a lower chance of having good necrosis, but has an outcome as good as osteosarcoma. We had published these prognostic factors in expert reviews just to highlight that histological necrosis is still one of the key factors. Now the question whether to operate upfront or to give chemotherapy later after surgery or to give neoadjuvant. There's only one study which has looked at this, not many patients, but yet it showed one thing, that the survival was no different, whether you give chemotherapy before or after surgery. Even the limb salvage rates were no more in patients who had received neoadjuvant chemotherapy. So these are the agents which are effective in osteosarcoma: doxorubicin, cisplatin, high doses of methotrexate, ifosfamide and etoposide, and there was a combination earlier, BCD, which is bleomycin, cyclo, and dacarbazine. This was part of the T10 protocol, and this combination, the BCD, is no longer used by medical oncologists. So the T10 protocol emerged from Sloan Kettering. It's a relatively complicated protocol because it involves many drugs. Nevertheless, it had a very good outcome when it was first reported. Almost a disease-free survival of 75% for non-metastatic extremity osteosarcoma. However, when other centers tried the same protocol, the relapse-free survival was never 75%. It always stayed in the range of 55 to 60%. Then the European Osteosarcoma Intergroup did a trial to see if just two drugs, cisplatinum and doxorubicin, were better or worse than the combined, the more complicated T10 protocol. So the cisplatinum ADRIA was over 18 weeks versus the 44-week protocol of T10. And the results were that they were equal in both the groups. So the conclusion was that the two drugs, cisplatinum and adriamycin, are equally effective as the so-called more complicated T10 protocol. There has been a lot of interest in high-dose methotrexate, and perhaps a lot of oncologists would still use high-dose methotrexate in their upfront treatment regimen. For those, since we don't have any medical people here, high-dose methotrexate in osteosarcoma is used in a dose of 12 grams per meter square, administered over a 4-hour period. Let me tell you, this drug is very safe if properly administered, and almost impossible to manage the toxicity if improperly administered. So a trial was conducted, which was published in JCO. Here the research question was that does adding high-dose methotrexate to the two drugs, cisplatinum and doxorubicin, have any impact on outcome? The result was that in fact the two-drug regimen did better than the three-drug regimen. Although the overall survival was not different, but the disease-free survival by adding methotrexate was lower. This trial was heavily criticized for two reasons. Number one, the people who supported methotrexate said, the interval between chemotherapy with the methotrexate arm was 4.5 weeks versus 3 weeks for cisplatinum Adria. So that reduced the dose intensity of cisplatinum Adriamycin. The other criticism of this trial was that the dose of leucovorin, which is used with high doses of methotrexate, was much higher. So we were antagonizing the chemotherapeutic effect of methotrexate. I had introduced this slide more for the people in training orthopedics to tell about dose intensity. Typically, when we give chemotherapy, the blood counts drop and then they rise at week number 3. So typically a cycle of chemotherapy with the commonly used drugs is from day 0 and the next one comes at day 21 when the blood counts rise. The thought process is that if you can give the chemotherapy every 2 weekly and dose intensify, maybe the tumor will respond better so that you do not allow the tumor to grow in between. So what people do is that they start growth factors here, and instead of this rise happening in the 3rd week, it happens at day 14. So we can give the chemotherapy every 2 weekly. So this strategy was tried. The two drugs were administered every 2 weekly instead of 3 weekly, in the hope that the outcome will be better. But what emerged was something very different, and it even challenged the whole thought process on necrosis. The necrosis was much more. The proportion of patients having higher necrosis was more in the group that received chemotherapy every 2 weekly, but there was no difference in the ultimate outcome. And it actually challenged the whole idea that necrosis, that good necrosis is better for predicting survival. To summarize, neoadjuvant chemotherapy or adjuvant chemotherapy is certainly needed for osteosarcoma. The effective drugs are cisplatinum, adriamycin, methotrexate, ifos, etoposide. No proven role of adding multiple drugs, although many centers still do it, and no proven role of dose intensification beyond 3 weekly in osteosarcoma. The protocol that we use at our center is we start with 3 cycles of cisplatinum adriamycin, and after 3 cycles we go for surgery. In patients who have good necrosis, we continue the same 3 cycles. Those who have poor histological necrosis or have metastatic disease, we add ifosfamide and etoposide to cisplatinum adriamycin. We have been using high-dose methotrexate for our patients at the time of progression and not in upfront osteosarcoma or MFH. We are also not sure of the role of adding more drugs based on the necrosis. There is controversial data. The COG believes that it does not make a change. There's a group from Italy which believes that it does make a change. We have been practicing like this. We are still in the process of analyzing our data, and we'll see where we are. I have not brought or not shown any data pertaining to the research that we have done. Our research on osteosarcoma so far has focused on predicting response by use of MRI based on PET-CT, predicting angiogenesis based on MRI, and I purposely deleted those slides for this workshop. I thought the audience probably would not be interested in that. I thought there'll be more postgraduates. For osteosarcoma, the conclusions are, unfortunately, for last 3 decades, there is no increase in survival. Despite multiple drugs, despite multiple trials, despite multiple combinations, we are still where we were. So it is a disease which is static in terms of outcome. We have succeeded in improving the definitions of prognostic groups, but we have not been able to provide good solutions. Even the work on the use of trastuzumab in osteosarcoma so far has not shown a significant beneficial effect. Although we know that the presence of HER2/neu is a poor prognostic factor in osteosarcoma. Switching gears to Ewing sarcoma, it's more chemosensitive than osteosarcoma. The tumor sometimes actually melts away. The effective drugs are vincristine, adriamycin, actinomycin D, cyclophosphamide, and alternating with ifosfamide and etoposide. Generally what we do is that we start with adriamycin in the cycles, and once we reach a cumulative dose of 375 milligram per meter square of adriamycin, we switch to actinomycin D. The data on adding ifosfamide and etoposide is like this. In metastatic Ewing sarcoma, there is no benefit of ifosfamide and etoposide. In non-metastatic, yes, there is a benefit. Now the same question of dose intensification in Ewing sarcoma, 2 weekly versus 3 weekly, just the way that was tried in osteosarcoma, there is a benefit. So by using 2 weekly chemotherapy, this is a recent paper in JCO, it shows that the 2 weekly regimen in Ewing sarcoma improves outcome in non-metastatic Ewing sarcoma. We have recently analyzed our data of extremity Ewing sarcoma of 158 patients, and this is in press in Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery American. And our data was that of the entire Ewing sarcoma family tumors, 42% were extremity Ewings. And 44% of the extremity Ewings were metastatic at presentation. And clearly, the localized group did better than the metastatic group. I would like to state here that these are consecutive patients of Ewing sarcoma and treated irrespective of their performance status. Likewise, the overall survival was better for the localized group compared to the metastatic group. The patients who underwent surgery with or without radiotherapy had a lower chance of having a failure as compared to the group which underwent radical radiotherapy. And this emerged as a factor even in the multivariate. We had another interesting factor which emerged in the multivariate analysis, and that was the white cell count at presentation. Patients who had a high white cell count, more than 11,000 at presentation, the chance of having an event was almost 90%. So only 10% of those patients ultimately made it. So the failure rates are so high when the white cell count is above 11,000. Our data suggests that all possible efforts should be made to resect the primary tumor, and that radical radiotherapy alone in this site, despite a good response to neoadjuvant chemotherapy, results in a poor local control rate. In non-metastatic Ewing sarcoma, those with high white cell count had inferior event-free survival and local control rate on multivariate analysis, and we wonder if this group merits more aggressive therapy. Switching gears from bone tumors to soft tissue tumors. So the first question, are adult type soft tissue sarcomas chemosensitive or not? Well, this tumor became like this with chemotherapy. So the answer is that they are sensitive. A question, does adjuvant therapy benefit in soft tissue sarcomas? Pediatric type, certainly the answer is yes, with conviction. Adult type, the data is controversial. But data is controversial because of the following reasons. Before I go to the reasons, the meta-analysis, which was published in Cancer 2008, showed that the two drugs, anthracyclines and ifosfamide, prolonged survival in patients with resected extremity soft tissue sarcomas. So the role of adjuvant was there in the meta-analysis. The reason why the controversy is there is because all the trials, what they do is they tend to include all soft tissue sarcomas in one basket, and then the question is asked, is it bringing any benefit or not? Well, there are more than 50 types of soft tissue sarcomas, and if we treat all carcinomas in a different way, if we treat all pediatric tumors in a different way, how can we club the outcome of 50 different types of soft tissue sarcomas with one single chemotherapy regimen? So I don't think that we can have the answer if we put all sarcomas in one basket and look for the benefit. Who should get adjuvant chemotherapy? High-grade tumors, size more than 5 centimeters, deep-seated and recurrent. That is the general accepted principle. In metastatic, the intent is palliative. The response rates are 15 to 45%, and actually 1/3 or 10% of those who have a response actually have a CR, and 1/3 of these can have a prolonged survival as well. But we modify chemotherapy in adult sarcomas based on their age, with the comorbidities, and we also analyze slow growing or rapidly growing. One has to take a call in the sense that if somebody has an alveolar soft part sarcoma in the lung and is doing perfectly well, one is not going to subject him to chemotherapy because we know that the traditional chemotherapy does not work there. So what are the effective agents for soft tissue sarcomas? The traditional ones are doxo, ifosfamide, gemcitabine, and docetaxel. The relatively newer ones are paclitaxel, trabectedin, pazopanib, imatinib, sunitinib. Imatinib is an old drug, but its role in sarcomas is relatively newer. Now, trabectedin, most of the other drugs you know, trabectedin, very interesting. It's a drug which comes, how it was discovered was that in 60s and early 70s, there was, the US government was funding for finding out the effective agents which may be present deep down in the sea.